"You must take her," Sir Giles begged, shoving the child towards Thomas. "The convent of the Blessed Saint Clare near Amiens. My wife's sister is the abbess there. It is her only hope. I have packed gold." He pressed a heavy leather pouch into Thomas's hands. Thomas stared, dumbfounded. "Sir Giles, you don't understand. This place is a tomb. We are all dying." "You," Sir Giles said, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. He ripped the glove from his hand and showed Thomas his palm. A small dark purple blotch was spreading across his lifeline. "My race is run. Swear to me, brother. Swear on your immortal soul you will see her safe." From the infirmary, the abbot appeared, leaning heavily on a novice. He was a ghost of his former self, but his eyes held a final spark of authority. "Brother Thomas," the abbot commanded, his voice a dry whisper, "you will do this. It is a holy quest. Perhaps God has spared you for this, to save one innocent soul from this great forgetting." He looked at the girl Alara, and a flicker of his old kindness softened his face. Go now. Take what you need. Do not look back. This is my final command. This is your penance, and your purpose." An hour later, Brother Thomas stood at the gate of St. Giles in the Vale. He wore practical leather boots and a heavy cloak over his monk's habit. A satchel with bread, dried meat, and Sir Giles's gold was slung over his shoulder. The little girl Alara held his hand, her tiny fingers a knot of fear in his calloused palm. He looked back at the scriptorium, at the beautiful sunlit windows. He thought of his psalter, left unfinished. He thought of the faces of his brothers, now silent beneath the snow. The fortress had fallen. The silence of God was deafening. He turned his back on the monastery, and with the silent, terrified child in tow, he walked out into the beautiful, deadly winter of the Reaper. Welcome, seekers of forgotten fears and chroniclers of the dark. I am your guide through the shadows of history. We often think of monsters as things that come from the outside, things that are different from us, that lurk in the woods or in the darkness beyond our walls. But what if the most terrifying monster isn't an it at all? What if the monster is your neighbor, the woman who sold you bread this morning, the friend you shared a drink with last night? What if they made a pact with pure evil, and now wear a human face to hide a soul that belongs to Satan? Today we are not just telling a story. We are lighting a torch and descending into the suffocating paranoia of the great witch hunts, an era when a book, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, became a bestseller, and gave men of God a divine license to suspect, accuse, torture and burn. It was a time when a personal grudge could become a death sentence, and the entire world felt like a courtroom where the verdict was decided long before the trial began. So I ask you this: what is more dangerous? The devil you don't know, or the one you think you do? Let me know your thoughts on that terrifying question in the comments below. Your perspectives are the lifeblood of this channel. If you believe these stories need to be told, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more journeys into history's darkest chapters. And make sure to ring that notification bell so you never miss an accusation. And finally, tell me, what other eras of mass hysteria or historical horror do you want to explore? Your suggestions chart our course. Now, let the doors be barred. Let the whispers begin. The arrival of Inquisitor Heinrich Voss in the village of Silberwald was as quiet and momentous as the first heavy snowfall of winter. He came on a gaunt black horse, a solitary dark figure against the blinding white of the mountain pass. The sun was brilliant, a rare and welcome gift in the heart of the Alps, and it made the snow-laden pines sparkle as if dusted with crushed diamonds. The beauty of the scene was absolute, divine, a testament to God's artistry. It was a beauty Heinrich knew that Satan loved to corrupt. He paused at the ridge overlooking the village, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Silberwald was nestled in the valley below like a child's toy, its timber-framed houses and the tall spire of its stone church all burdened with a thick, pristine blanket of snow. It looked peaceful, pure, but Heinrich was not a man deceived by surfaces. He was a geologist of the soul, trained to see the faults and fractures that lay beneath the most placid exteriors. He knew that here, as everywhere, the devil was at work. His presence was like a subtle poison in the water, a creeping rot in the timber, a shadow that clung to even the brightest sunlight. Heinrich was not a large man, but he carried an aura of immense, unyielding authority. His black cassock was clean but well-travelled, his face sharp and intelligent, his eyes a pale, piercing grey that seemed to take in everything and give away nothing. He was 35 years old, but his soul felt ancient. weighted with the grim knowledge of humanity's weakness. In a leather satchel at his side, protected from the elements, was his most important tool. Not a crucifix, not a vial of holy water, but a book. It was a copy of the Malleus Maleficarum, its pages filled with his own spidery annotations. It was not merely a book to him. It was a weapon, a shield, and a map of the enemy's territory. It was the hammer of witches, and he was its willing hand. As he rode down into the village, a silence fell over the few peasants clearing snow from their doorways. They stopped their work, leaning on their shovels, their faces a mixture of awe and raw fear. They knew who he was. The letter from the bishop, announcing his arrival to investigate certain spiritual maladies, had arrived a week prior, and the village had been buzzing with whispers ever since. He was the Inquisitor, the witch-finder, a man who walked and talked with the authority of God himself. He was met at the village square by Burgomaster Schmidt, a stout, florid man whose expensive fur-lined coat seemed at odds with the village's apparent poverty. Schmidt's face was arranged in an expression of deep piety and grave concern. He bowed low, his jowly face nearly touching his chest. "Inquisitor Voss," he boomed, his voice overly hearty. "Welcome to our humble, God-fearing Silberwald. Your presence is a balm to our troubled souls. A harsh winter has befallen us, and with it, a sickness of spirit." "Sickness is my domain," Burgomaster Heinrich replied, his voice calm and cold. He dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow. "God's light is brightest when it illuminates the darkest corners. Show me to my quarters. I will require a list of all recent misfortunes, every sick cow, every failed crop, every child afflicted with fits, every batch of beer that has soured. The devil's work is revealed not in grand gestures, but in the petty tapestry of ruin he weaves." For the next week, Heinrich set up his court in a small chamber adjoining the church. He did not rush. Haste, he knew, was a tool of the enemy. He spent his days in quiet observation, his evenings in prayer and study, rereading the familiar, terrible passages of his book. All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable. They are feebler in both mind and body, and it is not surprising that they should come more under the spell of witchcraft. The method of trial is in itself a form of exorcism. The words were a comfort, a fortification of his righteous purpose. The villagers came to him, one by one, summoned by the burgomaster. At first they were hesitant, speaking in fearful whispers. An old farmer, his face a roadmap of worry, spoke of his prize milk cow, whose milk had dried up overnight. A baker's wife, wringing her hands, lamented a batch of bread that had refused to rise, remaining a cold, dead lump in the oven. Burgomaster Schmidt was always there, nodding gravely, occasionally offering a helpful suggestion. "And whose shadow fell upon your cow that morning, Farmer Gerlach? Or, did not the widow Elsbeth pass your ovens that very day, wife Marta?" The name Elsbeth began to repeat, a recurring thread in the tapestry of ruin. Elsbeth was the village midwife and herbalist. She lived alone in a small, tidy cottage at the edge of the woods, a place some villagers already considered to be perilously close to the domain of darkness. She was a woman in her late 30s, still handsome, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a confidence that many found unsettling. She was unmarried, childless, and financially independent, her skills with herbs and healing so sought after that she owed no man her livelihood. To Heinrich, this profile was a blaring alarm. Such independence in a woman was unnatural. It was a vacuum that the devil delighted in filling. He summoned her. She came not with the frightened deference of the other villagers, but with a quiet, guarded dignity. She stood before his table in the cold, sunlit room, her hands folded, her gaze direct. "You are Elsbeth, the midwife," he began, his voice flat. "I am. It is said you have great skill with herbs, that you can ease a fever, or speed a difficult birth. God provides the herbs from the earth," she said carefully. "I only know how to combine them." "A pious answer," Heinrich said, a flicker of a cold smile on his lips. "But some might say such knowledge is not granted by God, but purchased from another master." He leaned forward, his grey eyes pinning her. "Tell me, Elsbeth, when you are alone in the woods gathering your roots and leaves, do you ever feel a presence? A whisper on the wind offering you more power, knowledge beyond that of mortal men?" Her composure did not break, but he saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. "I hear only the wind in the pines, Inquisitor, and I pray only to the Lord." "Do you?" he pressed. "Farmer Gerlach's cow is barren. He says you quarrelled with him over the price of a poultice for his wife's ailing hand just 2 days before. An argument, and then a maleficium. This is a common pattern. Farmer Gerlach is a stingy man who underpays for my labour," she said, a spark of defiance in her voice. His cow's health has nothing to do with my poultices. Everything has to do with everything, Heinrich countered softly, quoting a principle from his book. There are no coincidences in the war for men's souls, only assaults and counter-assaults. He dismissed her, but he knew her defiance, her unnatural self-reliance, her proximity to the dark woods, the whispers that now swirled around her like snowflakes in a storm. It all fit the pattern. The diagnosis was forming. The true proof came 3 days later, in the form of the burgomaster's own daughter, a pale, nervous girl of 10 named Greta. Schmidt brought her to the Inquisitor, his face a mask of paternal anguish. "Inquisitor, a terrible affliction has fallen upon my house," he declared. "My sweet Greta, she is tormented. She wakes screaming in the night, speaking in a voice not her own. She writhes and convulses, and in her fits, she speaks a name." He pushed the trembling girl forward. Heinrich looked at her, his gaze intense. "Child," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "tell me what you see in your dreams. Do not be afraid. The power of Christ compels you to speak the truth." The girl, Greta, began to sob. "The dark woman," she whispered, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed all too real. "She comes to my window at night. She flies without a broom. She has eyes like a goat, and she offers me a sweet cake made of black earth and blood. She says I will be her little sister if I just sign my name in her book." "And this dark woman," Heinrich said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "does she have a name? Have you seen her face in the village?" Greta's eyes darted to her father, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed. "It is the midwife. It is Elsbeth." It was enough. It was more than enough. The devil, in his arrogance, had overplayed his hand. He had used a witch to afflict the child of the highest-ranking man in the village. It was a direct assault, and it required a direct response. That afternoon, Heinrich, accompanied by the burgomaster and 2 newly deputized village guards, walked through the sun-drenched snowy streets to Elsbeth's cottage. The village, which had been alive with fearful whispers, now fell utterly silent. Doors cracked open, faces appeared in windows. The simmering paranoia was about to boil over. The enemy within was about to be named and dragged into the light. They did not knock. The guards, emboldened by the Inquisitor's presence, kicked the door in. Elsbeth was inside, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. She looked up, her face a mixture of shock and resignation, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. "Elsbeth Klein," Heinrich announced, his voice ringing with cold authority in the small herb-scented room. "By the authority of the Holy Office and in the name of God, you are accused of diabolism, maleficium, and entering into a pact with the enemy of man. You will come with us." Elsbeth looked past him, at the faces of the guards, men whose children she had delivered, whose fevers she had cooled. She saw no recognition there, only fear and a dawning, righteous hatred. She looked at the burgomaster, who stared back with a mask of grim duty that failed to hide a glint of triumph. "This is madness," she whispered. "No," said Heinrich, stepping into her cottage, his shadow falling over her. He held up his book, the Malleus Maleficarum, its leather cover gleaming in a shaft of bright sunlight that cut through the small window. "This is not madness, this is the law." The guards seized her, as they dragged her out of her home and into the blinding light of the snow. A collective gasp went through the watching villagers. It was a sound of horror, but also of a terrible, thrilling relief. The source of their misfortune had been found. The evil had been given a face and a name. Their community, they thought, could now be healed. But Heinrich knew better. This was not the end. This was the beginning. The serpent's teeth had been sown in the fertile ground of their fear, and he was about to watch, with righteous satisfaction, as an entire legion of demons sprang forth. The lockup was a place where time went to die. It was a single stone cell beneath the village hall, perpetually cold, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and despair. The only light was a thin, grudging sliver of sun from a high, barred window that did little more than illuminate the frost patterns on the opposite wall. For 3 days, Heinrich left Elsbeth in this hole. It was a calculated strategy, prescribed by the Malleus. Let the cold, the darkness, and the fear do their work first. Let the soul soften before the hammer falls. On the 4th day, he came for her. He did not drag her to his chamber. He entered hers, bringing a small stool and a single candle. The act was meant to be one of intimacy, of a confessor coming to a sinner. He placed the candle on the floor, its small warm flame pushing back the immense darkness, and sat before her. Elsbeth was huddled in a corner, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, her defiance crusted over with a layer of grime and fear. "Elsbeth," he began, his voice calm, almost paternal. "I am not your enemy. I am the physician of your soul. Your body may be forfeit, but salvation is still possible. Confess your pact. Tell me of the Sabbath. Help me understand the depths of the devil's treachery. A full and willing confession is a balm to the soul and a mercy from the Lord." "I have nothing to confess," she rasped, her voice rough. "There was no pact. There is no Sabbath. There is only a village full of petty grudges and a harsh winter." Heinrich sighed, a sound of disappointment, not anger. "The devil is a great liar, and he makes his servants stubborn. You are protecting him. Why? What did he promise you? Youth? Riches? Power over men?" He opened his book which he had brought with him, the pages rustling in the stillness. "The book teaches us that the first tool is persuasion. I am persuading you, Elsbeth. I am offering you the clean death of the sword over the purifying fire. I am offering you a chance to die with God's name on your lips, not Satan's. You offer me a choice of deaths for a crime I did not commit," she shot back, a spark of her old fire returning. "I delivered half the children in this village. I have sat by deathbeds and cooled fevers. That is my work, not this fantasy of devils and flying ointments you read of in your book. Your work is the very cloak of your sin." Heinrich's voice hardened. "The Malleus warns of this precise deception. The witch who heals can also harm. The midwife who saves a child is in the perfect position to offer another to her dark master. Your familiarity with life and death is not a defense. It is the very proof of your corruption." The debate was fruitless. He knew it would be. The devil had too strong a grip. He left her with a final warning. "The next time we speak, it will not be with words alone." The next stage was public. The horror had to be shared, the community made complicit. Heinrich ordered Elsbeth brought to the village square. The sun was brilliant, the snow achingly white. The villagers gathered, their faces pale and anxious. Elsbeth was stripped to her shift, her arms bound. The cold was a physical blow, but the humiliation was a deeper wound. "The devil seals his pact with a mark," Heinrich announced to the silent crowd, his voice ringing across the square. "A place on the body where his claw has touched, leaving the flesh insensible to pain. We shall find this mark." He produced a long, slender silver needle. Two grim-faced women, appointed for the task, held Elsbeth fast while Heinrich conducted the search. It was a systematic, violating process. He searched her scalp, the folds of her ears, under her arms. The villagers watched, mesmerized and appalled. Finally, he pointed to a small dark mole on her shoulder blade. "Here," he declared, "a teat for imps to suckle, an unnatural mark." "It is a birthmark," Elsbeth cried, her voice trembling with rage and shame. "My mother had one in the same spot." "A hereditary taint," Heinrich countered smoothly. "The sin passed from mother to daughter." He held the needle aloft, its tip glinting in the sun. "If this is flesh of God's making, it will bleed. If it is a mark of hell, it will not." He drove the needle into the mole. Elsbeth flinched, but no blood came. The flesh was numb from the biting cold. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. It was proof, irrefutable. The devil's mark was real. Elsbeth stared at her own shoulder in disbelief. The lack of blood a betrayal by her own body. With the public proof established, Heinrich could proceed. Elsbeth was taken back to the cellars, but this time to a larger room, one equipped for the questioning. The tools of the trade were laid out on a table, stark and brutal in the torchlight. The thumbscrews, the iron boot, the strappado ropes hanging from a pulley on the ceiling. "The witch's tongue is tied by a spell of silence," Heinrich explained calmly, as if lecturing a student. The burgomaster was present, a necessary witness for the state. "Pain is a key. It unlocks the spell and allows the truth to escape. This is not cruelty. It is a holy necessity." The first session was short. They used the thumbscrews. The pain was excruciating, a white-hot agony that radiated up her arms. She screamed until her throat was raw, but she did not confess. The second session, a day later, they used the strappado. Her hands were tied behind her back and the rope was thrown over the ceiling beam. She was hoisted into the air, her shoulders dislocating with a sickening series of pops. The pain was a universe. It blotted out thought, memory, everything but its own blinding, searing reality. Through a haze of agony, she heard Heinrich's voice, calm and persistent, asking the same questions over and over. "Who was at the Sabbath with you? What are their names? Give us the names, and the pain will cease." Names. That was what he truly wanted. A witch was never alone. A coven was a cancer, and he needed her to identify the other infected cells. She broke. Hanging in the darkness, her body a symphony of torment, a single desperate thought of revenge bloomed in her mind. If she was going to burn, she would not burn alone. She would drag her accusers into the fire with her. "I will confess," she croaked, her voice a barely audible whisper. She was lowered, her broken body slumping to the floor. They gave her water. Heinrich knelt beside her, a scribe ready with ink and quill. "Tell us," he urged. "Tell us everything," and she did. She gave them the lurid fantasy they craved. She spoke of flying to a blasted oak on the mountain, of smearing herself with an ointment made from the fat of unbaptized infants. She described the Black Mass, the desecrated host, the obscene kiss upon the devil's hindquarters. She recited the script written in the pages of Heinrich's own book. And then, she gave him the names. Farmer Gerlach was there, she whispered, her voice gaining a venomous strength. He played a pipe made from a human thigh bone. And Marta, the baker's wife, she danced with a demon with the head of a goat. And the burgomaster was the master of the feast. A shocked silence fell over the room. The scribe's quill froze. The burgomaster, who had been watching with grim satisfaction, went pale as death. "She lies. The demon speaks through her. She is trying to drag down the righteous." But Heinrich simply raised a hand. "The devil is cunning," he said, his eyes alight with a terrifying intellectual fire. "He often hides his most prized servants in plain sight, in positions of power. Of course, it is all part of the pattern." The contagion had begun. That afternoon, Farmer Gerlach and the baker's wife Marta were dragged from their homes, screaming their innocence. Their protests meant nothing. They had been named by a confessed witch. They were tainted. The village was thrown into a maelstrom of terror. Who would be next? The neighbor who had looked at you funny? The cousin who owed you money? Every person was a potential accuser, a potential witch. The fear of the enemy within was no longer a theory. It was a firestorm consuming Silberwald. But the masterstroke was yet to come. With the burgomaster himself now under suspicion, Heinrich needed a grand gesture to re-establish order and demonstrate the full scope of the demonic infestation. He turned his attention back to the source, Greta, the burgomaster's afflicted child. He announced a public exorcism. The entire village was ordered to assemble in the church. The building was packed, the air thick with fear and morbid curiosity. Elsbeth and the newly accused were chained to pillars at the back, forced to watch. Greta was brought to the altar, where she began to writhe and thrash on the cold stone floor. Ad retro Saturnus. Heinrich's voice boomed through the church, resonating with absolute power. He held a crucifix aloft. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I command thee, unclean spirit, to depart from this child of God." Greta screamed, a high, piercing wail that curdled the blood. Then her voice changed, dropping into a low, guttural, masculine growl that seemed impossible from such a small body. "She is ours," the voice snarled. "The girl belongs to the master of the feast, the man of wealth, the burgomaster." The crowd gasped as one. Schmidt, standing near the front, looked as if he had been struck by lightning. This was not how he had planned it. He had meant to use the hunt to destroy his rival, Elsbeth. He had never imagined the fire would turn on him. "Lying spirit," Heinrich roared, sprinkling holy water on the child, which seemed to burn her skin. "Your tricks are known to me. You will not hide behind the innocent." The exorcism was a terrifying piece of religious theatre. Greta convulsed, spat, and blasphemed, her demonic voice naming more and more villagers, her accusations weaving a web of conspiracy that implicated half the town. She coughed up a bent, rusty nail, which Heinrich proclaimed was an object teleported into her stomach from hell itself. She shrieked as he pressed the crucifix to her forehead. For an hour the battle for the soul of the child and the village raged. Finally, with one last agonized scream, Greta went limp, collapsing into a seemingly peaceful faint. Heinrich stood over her, panting, his face drenched in sweat but shining with triumph. "The demon is cast out," he proclaimed to the terrified, awestruck villagers. "The child is cleansed." He turned his blazing eyes to the congregation, his gaze sweeping over their faces. He was no longer just an inquisitor. He was their savior, the man who had wrestled with Satan in their own church and won. His power was now absolute. He then pointed to the accused, chained to the pillars. "But the servants of the demon remain. Their corruption lingers. The jail is full, but the evil is not yet contained. The town must be purified. It must be cleansed with fire. Outside the church, the sun was beginning to set, painting the snow-covered mountains in hues of gold and blood. In the village square, under the direction of Heinrich's deputies, other villagers had already begun their work. The rhythmic, steady thud of hammers echoed in the cold air. They were building the pyres. The day of the burning dawned with a terrible, sublime beauty. The sun rose into a cloudless sky. Its light so brilliant it seemed to set the very air on fire. The snow on the mountains surrounding Silberwald glittered with a cold, holy light, turning the valley into a vast open-air cathedral. It was a perfect day for a sacrifice. The 3 pyres dominated the village square. They had been built high, with a grim and practiced efficiency. At the center of each was a thick, upright stake. The wood was stacked loosely to allow the air to draw, ensuring a hot and vigorous fire. Heinrich had overseen the construction himself, for the Malleus was clear. A poorly built pyre that merely suffocated the condemned was an insult to the purifying purpose of the flames. The fire had to consume, to render the corrupted flesh back into its elemental state, freeing the soul and cleansing the community. The entire village was compelled to attend. It was not an execution to be hidden away. It was a public sermon delivered in the language of fire and screaming. They gathered in a silent, fearful ring around the square, their breath misting in the cold air, their faces pale in the bright sun. The children were there too, held by their parents so they might witness the terrible wages of sin. Heinrich stood on the steps of the village hall, a black figure of absolute authority against the sunlit snow. Beside him a nervous-looking Father Anselm, the village priest who had been utterly sidelined by the Inquisitor, clutched a prayer book with trembling hands. The condemned were brought out. First came Farmer Gerlach and the baker's wife Marta. Their spirits were broken, their bodies ravaged by the questioning. They stumbled, their eyes wide and vacant, their minds already lost in a fog of pain and terror. They no longer had the strength to protest their innocence. Then came Elsbeth. Her body was a wreck, her arms hanging uselessly at her sides, but her spirit, though battered, was not extinguished. As the guards dragged her towards the central pyre, she raised her head. Her sharp, intelligent eyes swept over the crowd, over the faces of the people she had known her entire life. She saw their fear, their hatred, and most damningly, their relief. She was their scapegoat, the vessel into which they could pour all their anxieties about the harsh winter, the sickness, the inexplicable cruelties of life. Her burning would make them feel safe again. She locked eyes with Heinrich. There was no fear in her gaze now, only a profound, burning contempt. "You are the real devil, Inquisitor," she said, her voice a raw croak but carrying in the stillness. "You came to this village with your book and your certainty, and you taught us to hate. You have set fire to our souls." Heinrich did not flinch. "The devil speaks with your tongue to the very end," he said calmly. "But the fire will silence him." The 3 were tied to the stakes. Father Anselm began to read the last rites, his voice thin and quavering, a pathetic counterpoint to the monumental horror of the scene. Elsbeth ignored him, her gaze still fixed on Heinrich. Heinrich raised his hand, and the crowd fell utterly silent. "Let this day be a lesson," he proclaimed, his voice ringing with power. "Let this fire be a beacon of warning to the minions of Satan. Here in Silberwald, the line has been drawn, the enemy has been found, and he has been defeated. God is with us." He nodded to the guards. With torches held high, they approached the pyres. The crowd held its breath. It was in that moment of terrible suspended silence that the first scream came. It did not come from the condemned, it came from the crowd. A woman shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at her own husband. "He was with them," she screamed, her face contorted in a mask of terror and madness. "I saw him in a dream. He flew from our window and left a smell of sulphur." The accusation, born of the fertile ground of paranoia Heinrich had so carefully tilled, was like a spark in a powder keg. Her husband lunged at her, trying to silence her, but others in the crowd pulled him back. Then another voice cried out, an old man, pointing at the now-forgotten burgomaster Schmidt, who stood pale and sweating in the crowd. "Schmidt coveted my land. He sent a blight upon my crops. He is one of them." The contagion of fear, which had been simmering for weeks, now exploded into a full-blown plague of hysteria. The carefully constructed theatre of the execution collapsed into chaos. Neighbor turned on neighbor, friend on friend. Long-buried grudges, petty jealousies and sheer mindless terror erupted in a wave of shouted accusations. The crowd was no longer a collection of individuals, it was a single shrieking mob, its reason consumed by the fire before a single flame had even been lit. Heinrich watched, his face a mixture of shock and dawning horror. This was not according to the book. This was not the ordered, righteous purification he had envisioned. This was anarchy. He had sought to control the fire, and instead it had leaped the firebreak and was consuming everything. "Silence," he roared, but his voice was lost in the cacophony. The guards, overwhelmed, looked to him for orders, but he had none to give. The mob surged forward. A group of men seized the screaming woman's husband. Another group dragged the burgomaster from the crowd, his fine coat tearing as they clawed at him. In the midst of the chaos, Elsbeth began to laugh. It started as a low chuckle and grew into a full-throated, mirthless laugh of pure, despairing triumph. It was a terrible sound, the laughter of a prophetess watching her darkest prophecy come to pass. "You see, Inquisitor," she shrieked, her voice cutting through the din. "You see the harvest you have sown." Her laughter seemed to snap Heinrich out of his stupor. He saw the situation for what it was, Satan's final, most cunning trick. The devil had abandoned his servants on the pyres and had entered the crowd itself, turning their righteous fear into a murderous frenzy. "Light the fires," he screamed at the guards. "Light the fires now. Let the sight of God's justice calm their spirits." The guards, desperate to obey a clear command, thrust their torches into the kindling. The dry wood caught instantly. With a great whoosh, flames erupted, clawing their way up the three pyres. The heat was immense, pushing the mob back for a moment. The screams of Gerlach and Marta were sharp, animal sounds of agony, quickly consumed by the roar of the fire. But Elsbeth did not scream. As the flames licked at her feet and caught the hem of her shift, she kept her eyes locked on Heinrich, her terrible laughter ringing out even as the fire enveloped her. Her burning form, a black silhouette against the raging orange inferno, was his final accuser. The sight of the burning did not calm the mob. It inflamed them. Drunk on the spectacle of death, they turned on the ones they had seized. They beat the burgomaster to the ground. They bludgeoned the accused man with stones and shovels. The sun-drenched, snow-covered square became a canvas of brutal, spontaneous slaughter. Heinrich stood on the steps, utterly powerless, watching the village he had come to save tear itself apart. His book, his certainty, his rigid theology, it was all useless against this storm of human madness. He had followed the rules, performed the rituals, identified the enemy, and the result was not order, but a bloodbath. He saw the face of the devil then, not in a goat-headed demon or a flying crone, but in the twisted, hating face of a farmer bringing a rock down on his neighbor's head. He stumbled back, away from the heat of the pyres and the screams of the mob. He retreated into the cool, silent church, the door booming shut behind him, closing out the sounds of his failure. He collapsed onto a pew, his body shaking, his mind a shattered wreck. He had wanted to bring God's light to Silberwald. Instead, he had brought an inferno. He stayed in the church as the day died, and the screams faded into a stunned, exhausted silence. He did not know how long he was there. When he finally emerged in the twilight, the scene in the square was one of apocalyptic devastation. The pyres had burned down to glowing skeletal heaps of charcoal. The snow was trampled and stained with blood. Bodies lay where they had fallen. A few survivors drifted through the scene like ghosts, their faces blank with shock. Silberwald was dead. It had not been killed by the devil, but by the fear of him, by the very cure Heinrich had administered. He found his horse, saddled it with trembling hands, and rode out of the village without looking back. He did not know where he was going. He was no longer an inquisitor. The title felt like a mockery. His faith, once a fortress of stone, was now a ruin of smoke and ash. He rode for days, an automaton, guided by some instinct for survival. He was haunted, not by demons, but by the memory of Elsbeth's laughing, burning face. He was haunted by the faces of the villagers, transformed by the holy terror he had unleashed. Years later, a traveller passing through that valley would find the village of Silberwald empty, its houses slowly collapsing, its church spire a jagged finger pointing to a silent heaven. The snows of winter would come and go, covering the bones and the bad memories, but the story would be whispered in other valleys, a cautionary tale of a town that burned itself to death. And of the Inquisitor, Heinrich Voss, nothing was ever heard again. Some say he died of exposure in the high passes, his body buried by the same indifferent snow. Others whisper a darker tale, that he lived out his days in a remote monastery, a silent, hollowed-out man, spending his every waking hour illuminating a single terrible image over and over again on scraps of vellum. It was the image of a laughing woman, wreathed in flames, and standing beside her, holding the torch, was a man with the Inquisitor's own cold, certain and damned face.